massive group, meeting another massive group. And as you can imagine, in such a multi-ethnic area, people always say who you meet. It's not just a man. You say whether it was Nganasan, and Tundra Nenets, and Evenki, or forest Enets. They usually say who you meet, and also, not always, but quite often, they commented on the language of communication. And this is a great resource as a result, because you can kind of put all these encounters into a table and write down who met whom and which language they spoke. It's not always straightforward in the sense that, as you will see, when there are groups of people for whom you never, the storytellers never tell the language. Like when Nganasan would meet an Enets, never a language will be commented on, which means that everyone in the audience understands which language they used. Or if an Enets or Nganasan would meet an Evenki, you remember the language are quite different, then they'd always be said which language they used, or that they couldn't understand each other, and if they couldn't understand which was the language Evenki or Nganasan. So, it's not always straightforward in saying which language was used, but there is a lot of information about languages. And this is not because this barista here asked them about it, but generally because languages are an important part of their life. Like today, if you would ask people about their old life and they tell you stories, they also tell you a lot about languages. Today elders of these new ethnic communities, they also, even though if their linguistic skills in their native languages may be quite weak, and they talk to me in Russian, they remember a lot of these linguistic details. So this kind of meta-linguistic awareness is very typical for the area. And this is in contrast to some other areas of Siberia, like when I told to a colleague who works in the area where there are Evens and Yakuts, so just two languages, and she tried to ask for this kind of retrospective narratives. Who your parents, did they use Evan, did they use Yakut? And people couldn't understand what she was asking, and they kind of didn't pay attention to this kind of, it's not a part of the kind of everyday discourse. And in Tajmyr it is, and I know at least for another multilingual area of Siberia, which is further east, where there are Yurak, Evens, Yakuts, and Turkics meeting, and they also always talk about languages, like as if it is something very present. And so from these interviews, we know as much as we could know about multilingual practices of the second half of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and then I have done last year in 2017 specifically a series of sociolinguistic interviews with the Enets and Nganasan and the Tundra Nenets elders. And from these interviews, I tried to reconstruct the practices of their parents and grandparents and basically the deepest in time I could go was the 1930s. So it's kind of when their grandparents or parents were young adults, and and then the end period of kind of this situation is 1970s, because basically from the 1970s the multilingual practices stopped and everyone started speaking Russian to each other. So even though people continued speaking their native languages in the family, like the Nganasans would still speak Nganasan in the 1970s, 1980s, maybe even 1990s, but between ethnic groups, Russian would be used, not the languages, not indigenous languages as before. So from these two sources, we can reconstruct the picture from the middle of the 19th century till the 1970s, and I'll show it to you. These pictures I have shown you in the first lecture, but maybe it was reminding after you can learn more about what these languages are. So this would be the 19th century, and first I show you all the groups, and then I will tell you the languages that they have used with each other. So we have Tundra And importantly, this big orange spot is summer, and this small spot is winter. And winter is like 8 months a year, so most of the year is winter. And that's where they are. Okay, and most of the year they are together with this brownish we call forest Enets. So Tundra Nenets here and forest Enets here, and in winter they're together. And also there are some nomadic forest Enets. Most forest Enets are settled, and so they stay here in summer and in winter. But some forest Enets are nomadic, and that's why you see these lines of brownish. So in summer, all nomadic people, both Tundra Nenets and both forest Enets, need to go to the north to avoid mosquitoes, basically. And so this is the territory that they share together in summer. And then you have the Nganasans. Importantly, this is the area where they would come in summer for fishing and hunting, and occasionally reindeer herding, and the same for Tundra Nenets. In winter, the Nganasans would go here, kind of also to the north, to the forests. And then you see the Dolgans, and as I have mentioned before, the Dolgans would come to this territory in summer. So in the 19th century, the Dolgans and the Nganasans didn't really share their lands, but they were not in the same time, at the same place. And then you have some Nganasans and some Tundra Nenets who live in the Dolgan territory here, and who were later assimilated and switched to Dolgan. Okay, and then we have Evenki, and the Evenki, as you might remember from yesterday's presentation on the Dolgans, the Evenki and Dolgans everywhere shared their territory, so there was no place where there would be Dolgans without the Evenkis. Even though it's kind of, my statement is hard to verify, because we don't know whether they were the Dolgans, but these people who lived in this area were shown by green and purple, whether they were really the Dolgans or yet they were yet Evenkis speaking Yakut. So, but importantly, they all live together there. And then you have these Russians here and Russians here, who were also kind of, by the 20th century, switched all to this Dolgan or to Yakut, and so became a part of the Dolgan ethnic group. So here you see, this separate ethnic groups before they all merged into Dolgan. So the languages. We start with Tundra Nenets and Enets. So this is these small arrows. And importantly, there was no summer interaction between the Tundra Nenets, the biggest guys in the north, and Tundra Nenets. So it is only in winter here that Tundra Nenets met any Tundra Nenets. Because here they have a big river separating them, and they didn't cross the river. You can cross the river in winter, of course, but in winter there was no one here. In winter everyone was here. Most what we know about the context between Nenets and Enets is about context between Nenets and forest Enets. And what we know that by the end of the 19th century, the forest Enets material culture was replaced by the Tundra Nenets material culture. I mean, clothing, the ways to deal with reindeer, the sledges, tents, all this kind of traditional stuff. And so this Middendorf traveler, in his publication of 1878, reporting on his travels maybe a couple of years earlier, that was the last mentioning of some forest Enets families wearing traditional clothes of the Tundra Nenets and Nganasan types, which means not Nenets. And after that, no one has ever seen forest Enets wearing non-Nenets clothes. So basically, and that was kind of the last family that he saw. So really, it was the end of it. And so, which means that such borrowing of wholesale material culture, such as really high degree of forest Enets and Tundra Nenets contacts by the end of the 19th century, there were not yet so many intermarriages between forest Enets and Tundra Nenets. There were some, but not so many. So this material culture was just taken not because of intermarriages, but just because they lived together near each other. And when we took these old stories from 1930s and see what they tell about the language choice when an Enets would meet an Enets, then in most cases they would not comment on the choice. Not in all cases, like the Nganasan Enets contacts never were commented on. These contacts have been commented on sometimes, but not rarely. Which means that the language that they used was almost self-evident. And we know from 1930s that the bilingualism between Nenets and Enets was common. So it's quite probably that there was bilingualism before as well. It's not entirely clear whether this bilingualism was full or receptive, because the languages are pretty close, and with practice each party can speak their own language and understand each other. And basically in the 20th century we have a lot of stories of interethnic marriages when one spouse would speak Nenets and the other spouse would speak forest Enets, and kind of they do not use a common language. They speak to each other in their own language. So we know that there was receptive bilingualism in the 20th century. So maybe it was also receptive in the 19th century, or maybe it was full in some cases. This is hard to say definitely. So now we come to the pure Tundra Nenets who live here, and nomadic forest Enets. And what we know about them are two basic facts. That in the census of the end of the 19th century, these nomadic forest Enets spoke forest Enets, but in the census of 1926, all these forest Enets remembered and claimed themselves to be forest Enets, but they all spoke Tundra Nenets already. Which means that in the end of the 19th century there was most probably asymmetric bilingualism. So basically those few forest Enets who came with their reindeer to this big territory, which was mainly inhabited by Tundra Nenets, they also kind of quickly acquired their language and used Tundra Nenets when they spoke to Tundra Nenets, used forest Nenets within their families, but then languages are very close, so the effort was not worth it, and they quickly switched and started using Tundra Nenets also in the families 30 years later. Okay, now we come to the pair Tundra Nenets and Nganasan. Over here, what kind of language did they use? And what we know about the context between these two ethnic groups, we know that the contacts were there from at least the 7th century. We know that they were close neighbors, and we know that in the 19th century already there were intermarriages and they lived together. So we have archival data for the end of the 18th century. About 20 Tundra Nenets men married to Nganasan women, and 14 Nganasan men married to Tundra Nenets women. And at that time, the Tundra Nenets would be about 300. So it's not the majority definitely, but from these 300, maybe half of them would be children. So then usually just 150, and 20 of them are married to Nganasan women, which means that some proportion of the population was already intermarried. And importantly, in that time, in the 19th century, Tundra Nenets do not yet marry anyone except the Nganasan. So so they didn't yet marry Tundra Nenets. So they mostly marry between themselves, or they marry Nganasans, and the same for the Nganasans. They either marry between themselves, or they marry Tundra Nenets. And by the end of the 19th century, the material culture of the Nganasans and Tundra Nenets were identical. It's not clear who borrowed from whom this material culture, but starting from the end of the 19th century, they had the same clothes, the same ways of dealing with reindeer, the same sledges, and so on. And the choice of the language of communication in these stories reporting about the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, the language is never commented on. So it was never a problem for Nganasan to understand the Tundra Nenets, or for Tundra Nenets to understand Nganasan. And yes, and we know that in the 20th century there was a lot of symmetrical bilingualism. So if you look at the map, all those Western Nganasans who lived here and who came here could speak Tundra Nenets, and all those Tundra Nenets who lived kind of here and not here, they could speak Nganasan. And so we can project this bilingualism back to the 19th century, since we know that there were no problem in understanding. These languages are quite different, so you cannot, the Tundra Nenets and Tundra Nenets, you can understand something with practice without speaking it. Here you can get a practice of understanding, but quite limited, and it requires much more kind of thing to really live together in the same tent, or like two tents near each other for a long time to start understanding the language. They are different. So what we say? Yeah, so there was massive symmetrical bilingualism. From what we know in the 20th century, basically, that it was full for some people and receptive for some people. So if these are spouses, they would be fully bilingual in each other's language, or if they are maybe kind of having two tents near each other, then they could be receptive and bilingual. What we have now? Okay, we have the pair Tundra Nenets and settled forest Nenets. So those forest Nenets who never move, who always stay here, and Tundra Nenets who come to them in winter. The fact that both languages were retained suggests that no one spoke the language of the other party, so it was symmetrical. However, it's not, we have no idea whether it was full receptive, but here languages are very similar, so kind of it would be much more probable that the bilingualism was receptive, like, I don't know, like, the difference is less than between English, German and Dutch, or like Russian and Belarusian. There is really little difference between them, so you can speak them and understand each other. And then an interesting point, the last point here, is about what was the language of communication with these Dolgans and Evenkis and the Enets people. The Nganasans didn't really meet them much, so most probably they didn't talk to each other a lot. But these guys met and talked, and so what they used. Importantly, at that time, the 19th century, the Dolgans and the Evenkis are not differentiated in local Russian. So they're called Tungus, both of them. So, and not only local Russian, but also if you take Tundra Nenets, Forest Nenets, and Nganasan, or Tundra Nenets, all these languages have just one word, meaning both Evenki and Dolgan. So you cannot deduce who was meant. They were really taken as one group. And these Tungus, they were called Evenkis and Dolgans. The interactions with them were mostly warlike. Both the Enets and the Tungus used to steal women, reindeer, from each other. And then, so all the stories about interactions is how someone has stolen reindeer women and then the other revenged, or kind of managed to go away, and there was no revenge after that. It's unclear when this practice is stopped, so they definitely reported for the 19th century century, but not for the 20th century. So in the 20th century it was already rather peaceful, but we don't know exactly. And when in all these stories collected by Voronovo, there are a lot of negotiations around these conflicts. And both the Enets party and the Tungus party could express themselves in the language of the other party, if they needed to. And the languages are very different, and these interactions are not very, well, they're quite short, and they're not every day. So because the languages are so different, you do not expect that they really had full common to these languages. But it looks like they had basic skills in these languages. So quite often the stories are about disguising. So like an Enets would kill an Evenki and put on his clothes and come to an Evenki camp and pretend he's an Evenki, which means that he must pick something to be able to do it, and the other way around. And definitely no Russian, or for that time Govorka, is mentioned for that time. So kind of always they either do not understand each other, which is rare, or they kind of can explain, and it's never said that it was in Russian. It's usually commented whether it was Evenki or Enets, which means that Govorka was not there yet at least by the middle of the 19th century. Maybe it was appearing because it's still, no exact dating is possible for this small period. It's somewhere in the second half of the 19th century, but we don't know when exactly. And importantly, it's not, if you look at the map, not all Enets met Evenki and Dolgan. So you can imagine these guys who came to Evenki here, and they may never meet the Tungus, which means they would not have the basic skills of their language. And the same for the Dolgans and Evenkis. The territory is huge, so only those who live nearby would have the skills. Okay. Yeah, and so the Nganasans and the Dolgans or the Evenkis had hardly any interactions yet. Oh yeah, and the last thing is basically those guys, how the Dolgans, the Evenkis and the Russians, how they talk to each other. And what we learned yesterday, that they all used Dolgan. So the Evenki used this language of the Yakuts, and the Russians also used this language. So this was asymmetric bilingualism. So if we kind of summarize it the other way around, if we speak of an ethnic group, for example, Tundra Nenets, what were their languages in the 19th century? So beyond Tundra Nenets themselves, they spoke and understood Tundra Nenets and Forest Enets, and the majority of Tundra Nenets also spoke and understood Nganasan and had some basic skills of Dolgan or Evenki. So this was a quite multilingual group, as you see. And then if we speak about Forest Enet, they were also quite multilingual because they all spoke or understood Tundra Nenets and could at least understand Tundra Nenets. And the majority of them had some basic skills of the Dolgan and Evenki. So they had one language less than these guys because they didn't have Nganasan, but still there were these 4 languages, 1, 2, 3, 4 that they had. Yes, if we speak about Tundra Nenets, they were not very multilingual because basically they could speak or understand Tundra Nenets or Forest Enets, and that's all. They were kind of from the edge of this multilingual area. And to the west, they had just Tundra Nenets and Tundra Nenets and Tundra Nenets. And the Nganasans also were not as multilingual as these guys in the middle because the majority of the western Nganasans could speak or understand Tundra Nenets. But basically that was it. So they didn't speak yet Dolgan or any, and on the east they would also have Dolgans, but they didn't have any interactions with them yet. And these guys, the Dolgans, the Evenkis and the Russians, they spoke Dolgan to each other, and they had some basic skills of Enets, and that's it. Then we go further in time, and with this picture with the 1926, which basically shows the first third of the 20th century. What we see is that more Tundra Nenets, these pink guys, go to the east, which means that the skill of Tundra Nenets by the Tundra Enets becomes really universal. But still, most Tundra Nenets would acquire Tundra Enets. This is different from the next picture, next in time, when there were so many Tundra Nenets that some of them already could go without Tundra Enets. Okay, and then by this time already we know that all these guys spoke definitely Dolgan. And then there were no more Russians or Enets or Nganasan speakers here. And also we know that kind of forest Enets and Tundra Enets split their lands so that even in winter they didn't intersect anymore. And those forest Enets who nomaded here became assimilated. So this group became more separate. Yes, and what about the kind of which changes in the battles of multilingualism we see? So the most important are connected to this end of context between forest Enets and Tundra Enets. And the most enigmatic is that we do not know about these kind of contexts. So in the 19th century there was no Russian yet, no Govorka yet. And then by the middle of the 20th century we know that these guys used Govorka to talk to each other. And what was going here in the beginning of the 20th century, this is a big unclear question. Unknown question, unknown answer to this question. Okay, now we come to the next time period. And here we need to remember that it's not only indigenous groups that moved, but also that there were some state-directed, some measures from the state, from the Soviet state that influenced the way local people interact with each other. So collective farms were created in the 1930s, there was quite a dramatic story in this area because this area was originally Tundra Nenets, and they were reindeer herders here. And then Tundra Nenets, as you saw in the previous map, started coming here, and these would usually be poor Tundra Nenets who would be taken as laborers, like as helpers, to reach reindeer herders. So what we see before the arrival of the Soviet power, that people with a lot of reindeer are Tundra Nenets. And Tundra Nenets are those who help them. And then you have the Soviet times. And then you need to have the collective farms to be established. And basically this, the Soviet power kind of relied on to the poor people to organize these collective farms and to kind of appropriate the private reindeer. And so it happened that most organizers of the collective farms were Nenets here in the area, and they were kind of, because they were poorer, and this rich reindeer, all rich reindeer herders were Enets, like half of them would be imprisoned and killed, and the other half would run away to the Nganasans, because it was further away, and like this river is the main transport way in the 1930s. So if you go away from the river, you are harder, it's much more difficult to reach you by the authorities. And of course, they were reached there 10 years later, but they didn't know it yet, and still it was some temporary relief. And so basically, these Tundra Nenets guys went to the Nganasans because they wanted to flee from the Soviet authorities, but because the Soviet authorities were represented by the Nenets, so also people tell that their parents or grandparents migrated and came to the Nganasan lands because the Nenets offended them. So, which is kind of not a true indigenous problem, but kind of the problem which was imposed by the authorities. And also, I have to mention, it's not only collectivization and the Nenets, but also there were a couple of years when there was famine. Kind of there were very few prey, kind of few fish, wild reindeer coming here. And if in such difficult seasons, it's easier. The Nganasan area here has forests. This is the same latitude, but they have forests here. The tree line goes like this. And so that's why in the forest it's easier to get food. So they also explain that their parents, when they're because there was more food there. And only, it's about, it's hard to say numbers, but maybe half of the Tundra Nenets families went there, which means about 30 families maybe, about 30 families, maybe 40, maybe 20, it's hard to say. And only one family returned, basically, so we know only one such a story. And when we, on the previous map, in the 19th century, we saw that many Tundra Nenets intermarried with Nganasan and spoke Nganasan. And when there was this migration, then basically anyone who had the connections with the Nganasans migrated. So those Tundra Nenets who stayed here, they usually could not speak Nganasan, and usually they didn't have any relatives among the Nganasans. So with this migration, the contact between the Tundra Nenets, the remaining Tundra Nenets, and the Nganasans stopped as well. And the Nganasans didn't come here anymore, just even the local Tundra Nenets ran away from these lands. And so here we now have a very intensive contact between the Tundra Nenets who arrived and the Nganasans, but the Tundra Nenets are the Nganasans are much more numerous in here. So you can think of maybe, as I said, 30 families arriving here and a couple of hundred Nganasan families here. So they all quickly intermarried and switched to Nganasan. So, well, they all spoke the Enets, but to their children they would use Nganasan. And so the Tundra Nenets in the 1940s, 1960s was this is the years when all my modern consultants from this area were kids. And they all say that the Tundra Nenets was the language of the adults. So their mother or their father or their aunt, they would speak Tundra Nenets when they met the other adult Tundra Nenets. And them as children were always directed, were always spoken to in Nganasan. Even, I mean, these interethnic marriages were both, both men and women went here. So you could have a father who was Tundra Nenets, but he would still speak Nganasan to his children. To his children, yeah. I mean, all parents always spoke Nganasan to the children in these interethnic marriages. Between each other, they would also speak Nganasan. It was only the Tundra Nenets adults who conversed in Tundra Nenets. If there was a gathering of Tundra Nenets adults and there would be a couple of Nganasans there, of course these Nganasans would also speak Tundra Nenets. But kind of you have to have a majority of Tundra Nenets adults for them to speak Tundra Nenets. And those kids from these interethnic marriages who have today know some Enets words or some can produce some little Enets or can understand Enets a little bit, they all tell me that they learned their Enets from a grandfather, a grandmother, a brother of their grandmother. So there were some older people who kind of were not concerned with. So the parents knew that it was important to transmit Nganasan to their children because that was the language of the area. And these older people could choose the language that they wanted, basically, and they would live alone, this old grandfather, old grandmother, alone in a tent. And when this little kid would come, they would talk their own Tundra Nenets to them, just for fun, to enjoy it. But that was not enough exposure, so basically those kids who had this kind of exposure, they said that they could understand some adult conversations in Tundra Nenets. But today they cannot speak to Enets anymore. So they could understand simple phrases, but they can hardly understand a text like a recorded in Tundra Nenets today. So that was this story. told you about this Tundra Nenets and Nganasan. Then we know that the Govorka already appeared here. So this is this blue arrow here and blue arrow here. So the Dolgans and the Nganasans and the Enets who were here, they spoke to each other in Govorka, even though there were still not many interactions. And this is a kind of common idea that they spoke Govorka to each other, which is true for many cases. But also, it looks like there was some bilingualism here. But it's basically, when I ask people, when I ask the Nganasans or the Dolgans now, here your parents, could they speak, if they were Nganasans, could they speak Dolgan, or could they speak, if they were Dolgan, could they speak Nganasan? And the answers are too incoherent, I would say. They could also say, of course they could speak, they live near each other. Or they would say, of course they couldn't speak it, they spoke only Russian to each other. And even the same person can answer you differently. So it looks like that I didn't really talk to more people and collect more data, because as if this is not just an issue of language choice, but also some language ideology connected to it. So as if they maybe there was quite a lot of bilingualism between the Nganasans and the Dolgans, but in practice there was bilingualism, but on the level of language ideologies they wanted to be separate. Or maybe it was the other way around, so they didn't really care that they were different. They didn't marry each other much, but they could really kind of have tents near each other for years, like, in the same places. So that they could go away, but then come back, and that was the place where they both fished in summer or whatever. So they could really have quite intense contacts, but maybe this very few common sentences they knew in each other's language was enough. So it's not really clear. And definitely some ideologies are connected. Okay, and here they definitely use Govorka. And they definitely didn't speak the languages of each other. These kind of the Forest Enets guys are very unambiguous in saying that, oh, that was this broken Russian that our parents used to talk to the Evenkis and the Dolgans. And they never could speak Enets, these Evenki and Dolgans. And then the last interesting area is here, where you have Forest Enets and Tundra Nenets. In the 1940s, in this period, if you compare, you just look here and I show you previous map. So you see that the territory of Forest Enets, they expanded kind of here. Yeah. So kind of there is no clear reason like here why they expanded, it just happened. But as a result, the situation here was very similar to the situation here, that the Enets, the Forest Enets here, became a smaller group within a bigger Tundra Nenets group. Like here, the Tundra Nenets became a smaller group between the big the Nganasan group. And here, the stories are very similar. So the parents would intermarry, there would be intermarriages here, both Forest Enets male and Forest Enets female would go here. And in all these interracial marriages, kids will be talked to in Nenets. So the same, you can have Forest Enets fathers, but they would use only Tundra Nenets to their children. And Forest Enets was the language of the adults. So when you have Forest Enets adults sitting together in the evening to talk, then they would speak Forest Enets. And also it's very important the idea of guests, especially in spring. You would have when spring, like April or May, when there is no winter winds anymore, and it's kind of I don't know, -10, and that's all. So it's really nice weather, but still there is a lot of snow for traveling, because like in summer you cannot travel. And everyone is so happy that winter is over. So this April, May is really the season for visiting your friends and relatives. And during these visits, many Forest Enets from here would travel here, because they would visit this, because this was just a very nice way to spend your time in spring. They would all go visiting somewhere here, and these people would go and visit somewhere here. Here you had less visits. These visits were more common in the beginning of the 20th century, so the same kind of idea of the visits. And during these visits, again, they tell, oh, when other relatives would come, yes, our parents always spoke their own language. And also, it's not only that the parents didn't address their children in their native language, the Enets parents here and the Enets parents here, but they also, when they met with these other relatives and friends that they haven't seen for a year, they would try to have their children away. They would say, go away, don't interact, don't bother us, it's our adult business, just go play outside. But these guys, they remember, today elders, they remember a lot how they were supposed to play outside with other kids and they didn't have a common language, but somehow they managed, but they didn't acquire the languages of each other. And so basically this is how the language shift from forest Enets to Tundra Nenets was going on, and here you have a language shift from Tundra Nenets to Nganasan. Then Russian arrived, and everyone switched to Russian. But given this kind of a picture, you can imagine that even without Russian, there would be very few Enets speakers left by today, just because only those guys who remained here, but then you have so many other Tundra Nenets coming that for the 1960s, the linguists report that younger Nenets do not speak Enets at all. So they come to their territory, but they didn't need the language to acquire the language anymore. So kind of those guys became assimilated by, becoming assimilated by Nenets. Those Tundra Enets become assimilated by the Nganasans, and those forest Enets become assimilated by the Tundra Nenets. And if not Russian, maybe this would be the area where some Enets, forest Enets, would be kept the longest, but not, maybe it will vanish after all too. And in the expanse of Tundra Nenets. So, what I was how can we summarize the patterns of the multilingualism in the area? Is that everyone would speak the language whose speakers are the most numerous in the area. So there was no idea that there is owners of this land, and that everyone has to speak their language. But there was the idea that with the most numerous, then we need to know this language. And I have nice stories about these Tundra Nenets who arrived to the Nganasan territory. And today, when these people speak Russian, they tell me things like, oh, when those Enets, when they became Nganasans, they could speak both languages, Nganasan and Tundra Nenets. But they say that they became Nganasans just by the fact that they arrived to the territory, not, and so the language was seen very practically. So this is the language of the majority, and we will speak the language. And if we speak this language, then we are this majority now. But most people would at least understand all other languages spoken in the area. So kind of the attitude to other languages was very positive, and attitude to speaking other languages and understanding them was very positive. So kind of understanding was very common. And on the level of the individuals, there was a combination of active and passive bilingualism. It basically depended on your own story. Whether you have married someone, whether you had close relatives, then you would have active bilingualism in this language. If not, you would have passive. But importantly, before the 20th century, there was no Russian, and then there was no lingua franca, so it was really kind of learning each other's languages. And then this family thing that then individuals who marry speak of the majority language would use the language of their spouse, with the spouse, and their children. And their native language will be used only with other adults or during guest visits. So this is also kind of a common pattern. It's repeated in two different places in Tajmyr. So this is a common model, but then you have waves of migration, and though the same people who are majority in one place become minority in a different place, and so they change their main language of communication. And this is kind of how the migrations change the multilingual practices is also the same in different places in Tajmyr. So that was it for multilingualism. And now I can comment on some language contact effects. Do you have any specific questions to the multilingual part? Okay. Here I cannot really say much, unfortunately, because the language contact research is really in its infancy. But first of all, it's the main reason why it is in its infancy, because the last 10 years gave us digital corpora for Tundra Nenets, Evenki and Nganasan, which means that if you have 3 main languages and you have just some smaller descriptions written in the 1960s, 1970s, and that's all, it's very hard to study language contact, even though you saw the linguists were interested in it and tried to write some smaller papers, but we didn't have enough data yet. And for the Tajmyrian Tundra Nenets and Dolgan, they're riot corpora. They are being created right now, the Dolgan corpora within the Uralic project and the Tundra Nenets, Tajmyrian Tundra Nenets within my project. So it's really kind of, even 2 years more, we will have even more data and be able to compare more. So now which kind of spotted language contact effects we can see, I can mention, they're basically all connected to Enets, just because, or in one case to Nganasan, because we have already this corpora and we can see this kind of stuff. There is a story for Tundra Nenets, forest Enets, and this story is quite short. I think I forgot it to take it from my presentation. A second, because I wanted to tell it to you at the second lecture. If we compare now forest Enets and Tundra Nenets, what we see some important splits in historical phonology, which gave divergent reflexes of some proto-Samoyedic phonemes. Like if you, for example, take a word for meat, it would be osa in forest and it would be uda in tundra. So like you would have quite many words with s in forest and dir in tundra. Or like a different proto-Samoyedic consonant is in the case of old woman. You would have mansi in forest and menyor in tundra, which kind of this cluster was rendered differently, and there are other words like this where you can ns here and nya here. And so these kind of words show you that they kind of split it quite a long time ago. And then there are some lexical differences, and importantly they're all in basic vocabulary. So if you take more kind of less frequent words, they would be the same. But if you take the most frequent words, they may be different. Like the word for head, for lake, for personal pronouns of second and third person, you and he, she. The word for word or language, for old man, for mind, the question word, what would be different. So basically, if you can imagine the first sentences that people could ask to check whether they understand each other's language, like, do you speak Enets? These sentences would sound differently in these languages. But if you take kind of a bigger text and you calculate the number of lexical differences, it would be very small. But it is in the basic lists. And then most morphosyntax is identical, and the syntax is identical. So they really kind of, this older historical phonology suggests, and this main kind of vocabulary suggests that they have split it quite a long time ago. But then, as you saw on the maps, they lived together for at least 100 years in winter, or maybe more. Yeah, so this is a picture for the 17th century. It's black and white, and you see this is the intersection. This is Tundra Nenets in the 17th century and forest Enets in the 17th century, and the intersection is very small in comparison to the rest of their territory. Then in the 19th century, you see you saw this picture in color, they share the same territory in winter. But in the beginning of the 20th century, okay, they stopped sharing their territories. Yeah. And we know that they kind of shared their territory at least from the beginning of the 19th century, so it is at least 100 years, maybe more, but not more than 250 years. And this is would be quite a good scenario for secondary convergence, right? So you have languages that split it, and that's why you have different phonology and some differences in basic vocabulary. But then they live together for 100 to 200 years, and the languages are still quite similar, and so that's why they really leveled their morphosyntax a lot. So now they have the same categories and with the same morphemes, and these categories are used in the same way. So it's really amazing how similar they could become. So this was the case of Tundra Nenets forest Enets. Then we have an interesting case because in the 1970s, after the last map I showed you, some Tundra Nenets migrated to the left bank of the Yenisei River, and this area is called Tundra. And so you have some Tundra Nenets who were within the majority of Tundra Nenets, and they still speak. There are still about 5 to 10 people who speak Tundra Nenets, and we have recorded them. And what we see that they have more lexical borrowings for cultural items from Tundra Nenets than other Tundra Nenets would do. And speaking about grammar, we just wanted only one thing, is these languages are related. So they have a cognate normalization morpheme, but this morpheme, this looks differently in different contexts. And basically these Tundra Nenets guys in the new territory, they sometimes use this normalization by the Nenets model. So they are supposed to use with some verbs, but they would use ma with these verbs because Nenets would use ma with these verbs. So the languages are quite close, and you can do some phonemic calculation if you want. And so that's why sometimes they would use this normalization incorrectly. Well, incorrectly in comparison to standard Tundra Nenets. But this is so far, they live among Tundra Nenets in 1970s, since 1970s, and we recorded them in 2000 something, 2008, 2009. So, which means after 30 years of contact, they have some limited interference, but very limited. Now, I also expect them to have more to use their categories in a more Nenets way, but this has not yet been studied. But if you speak of substance, it's only this thing that comes up. Then, if we compare forest Enets, which have been assimilated by Tundra Nenets, what we see, just like now, we see lexical borrowings for natural and cultural items, and not much more. Yeah, so it's not very interesting. And then there are two more peculiar cases. If we compare Northern Samoyedic and Dolgan, then we would see that second-person possessive markers are used for discourse purposes, and this is done in all Northern Samoyedic languages and in Dolgan. This is an example of Tundra Nenets. This is an example from a text, and basically it says, and the wolf there, its bottom goes from side to side down there. And so the wolf would have the second-person singular possessive marker, even though there is no connection to the hero of the story, right? It's really used to remind of the wolf, to show you that it is a topic, or that it is definite, or something like this. We see similar examples in Dolgan, like the old man said. Old man would have the possessive person, so it's the form of the affix is different, but it's also second-person singular possessive affix. And then this camp there was closed completely, and so this place was closed And so Florian Ziegel in his 2015 paper suggested that it's pretty probable that, and the Yakut doesn't use its second person possessive markers this way. So it looks like an areal influence from Northern Samoyedic onto Dolgan. And then all Northern Samoyedic languages, yes. Nenets, Enets, Northern Samoyedic. Yes, Northern Samoyedic languages have influenced it. On Dolgan, yeah. So all Northern Samoyedic, Nenets, Enets, and Nganasan have this pattern, and Dolgan has this pattern, but Yakut doesn't have this pattern, and Evenki doesn't have this pattern. So it looks like Samoyedic influence on Evenki. Okay, I have 10 minutes left, and I wanted to show you some slides from a joint presentation with Valentin Tungusic on the contact between Tundra Nenets and Nganasan. There is no, these are really slides from a presentation and not a paper yet, because we didn't finish in the sense that the topic is very interesting, because Tundra Nenets and Nganasan have been near each other for a long time, and as you might remember, there was this story that maybe the modern Nganasan people are the ethnic group that was linguistically assimilated by Tundra Nenets. So they have a lot in common, share kind of from common inheritance, but also they may have something which was kind of borrowed later in more recent times. To kind of separate the two, we try to summarize what are these common things in Tundra Nenets and Nganasan. And by the common things, we mean things which are absent in other Northern Samoyedic languages. So the things which are common for Tundra Nenets and Nganasan, but would be absent from Forest Nenets and would be absent from Tundra Nenets. As you will see now, some of them have parallels in Selkirk or in Forest Nenets, and then you understand it's a common retention here. So like Forest Nenets and Tundra Nenets have lost it, but these two guys, they were neutral and they kept it. In other cases, we do not see parallels in Southern Samoyedic languages, which means that it could also be a common retention, but it could be a common innovation. Maybe I will not have time to show all of them to you, but some. So basically, all the shared Nganasan Tundra Nenets features can be grouped into shared lexicon, which can be explained by common nature or common traditional culture. If we have phonetically regular lexical glottals, then there should be some cognates, common retentions. Or we can see that they cognate derivates, like using the same durational models. I'll show you examples. Or they can be phonetically irregular, and that we know they are borrowings from each other. So like kind of, you have some phonetic correspondences. You see this is the same word basically, but they must have looked differently if they were regular inheritance from Northern Samoyedic. And then all these things can be explained by common nature and culture, as I told you. And then there are some shared features which cannot be explained by anything. So there are some lexical features for which there is no objective reason why they would have it in common. And there are some grammatical features. Then they have some potential shared innovations, some discourse word borrowings from Nganasan and Tundra Nenets. And for discourse words, we know the direction of borrowings of this from Nganasan to Tundra Nenets. And then we have some civilizational loans from Tundra Nenets to Nganasans, because we know that Tundra Nenets met Russians before the Nganasans. So some Russian items entered Nganasans through Tundra Nenets. These are just to show you some words, what kind of words they are, which are cognates, which have been retained only in these languages, but not in other Northern Semitic languages. So this is a kind of a fur. This is part of a tent. This is what denotes in shaman speech. This is kind of also the personal objects in a tent. And this is a stuffed bird. So they're all connected to some common material culture. Or it can be like ice on a river. Again, the ecology of the ecology of Tundra Nenets and Nganasan is much more similar. and then forest Enets live more to the south. Or like they would have both a word for sea, which is basically an iterative participle from the verb staying awake, to stay awake. And the forest Enets and Tundra Nenets just didn't go that far north, and they didn't need a word for it, so they had no such thing. And then, like for tobacco, they would use both the verb to eat as nominalization, like the thing you eat. And forest Enets and Tundra Nenets doesn't do it. Forest Enets simply borrowed the word for tobacco from Tundra Nenets, and I don't know etymology for Tundra Nenets. And then these are the borrowings. So basically, like there must be more phonetic differences if they were both coming from Proto-Samoyedic. But this way they just did something in recalculation, but not all of them, and so that's why we know these were borrowings. And they also like the bird, type of a fish, type of a bird, kind of a game traditional, so also all connected to nature, material culture. Okay, the grammatical stuff. For example, they have the same past interrogative, while all the other guys, forest Enets, Tundra Nenets, and forest Enets, has a different for this past. Then, like we can take demonstrative or interrogative pronouns, and we see, like in Tundra Nenets, there would be Eloi, Koroye, Koroye, and in its very close sister, forest Enets, it would be Else, Korse, Korse. So basically, what we see, they take the same pronominal root, but the affix is different. And this affix is the same in Nganasan, to the extent that if you reconstruct and do these regular phonetic correspondences, it would be this Proto-Samoyedic, Proto-Northern Samoyedic affix that looks like this. But the forest Enets and Tundra Nenets use the same pronominal stems, but the Proto-Samoyedic suffix that they chose was different. So this is one of these examples. This is a similar example. That when you attach clitics to personal pronouns, you use a shorter stem, a truncated stem in Tundra Nenets and Nganasan, but you would use a full stem in forest Enets and Tundra Nenets. This is a small stem, this is this clitic, and this is a possessive. This is first person, it means only me. Then if you say only two of us, you would use the same stem, the same clitic affix, and then a different possessive. And the same is the structure in Nganasan. But if you look at forest Enets, you see the structure is the same. You have a pronominal stem, this clitic or affix, however you call it, and then a possessive marker. But then this is not more, but a kind of a bigger modi. And modi is also I in Tundra Nenets, but for the formation of this complex form, they chose a shorter variant, and the forest Enets and Tundra Nenets didn't choose a shorter variant. But we know that forest Nenets also used a shorter variant. So then we know that forest Enets and Tundra Nenets were innovative in this respect, while Tundra Nenets, Nganasan, and forest Nenets kept the older way of building these pronouns. And like an affix for mild imperative would be cognate in Tundra Nenets and Nganasan, it would be different in forest Enets, with no connection to Tundra Nenets. And then the last thing I wanted to show is morphosyntactic thing, is that both Tundra Nenets and Nganasan use negative interrogative clauses in the sense of an emphatic assertion. Basically, you want to say in Nganasan or in Tundra Nenets, he had a sister, and you insist on this fact. As you know, he had a sister indeed. And you say, basically you say, he didn't have a sister, like it would be a negative clause, negative interrogative clause. And the same in Tundra Nenets. I had a headache, and this is kind of an explanation why I went to get some vodka, and literally it means my head didn't ache. Was it right? So it's a question, it's a negated question. And this is common for Nganasan and Tundra but not for other northern Samoyedic. Forest Enets and Tundra Nenets have this negative construction, but to be able for the negative construction to mean something positive, you use special contrastive pleating after it. Like, how will I beat her? I live with her, as you know. This is
Tag question.
I live with her. Basically, it says I do not live with her, but it has a special contrastive pleating connected to the person number cross-reference marker, and then it means positive. And the same in Tundra Nenets. How couldn't I drive? The fox took away my kids, and then this is negative, like didn't take away. And then you have this contrastive pleating as well. So in Tundra Nenets and Forest Enets, you have this negation used affirmatively, but with a special morphological marking. But in Nganasan and Tundra Nenets, you have this negation in affirmative sense without any extra morphological marking, which is, again, we do not know whether it's a common pretension or common innovation, but it's clear that it's quite easy to copy. I mean, this is kind of a rhetoric device that if other people use it, I can also use it. Okay. I have to stop here. So there are some discourse words which are used in both languages. And then there are some civilizational loans like the word for chess, for bread, for flour, and for debt. And also for flour and for debt, they are nice because you see that they were derivatives in Tundra Nenets, and they've lost their derivational structure. They stopped being derivatives and they're not transparent anymore in Nganasan. Like in Enets, the flour meant dia is the word for earth, uda is the word for meat or food, so it's kind of food like earth. And then Nemsu is the word for food, but dia doesn't mean anything in Nganasan. They have a different word for earth. And this is how they call flour now. Or the word for debt, and you can imagine that the debt appears with Russians who are collecting tributes. In Enets, this is a verb to wait with a nominalization. And in Nganasan, the verb to wait is different. So it's really they kind of took the word and changed the vowels, or they should change them if you do phonetic recalculation. But then it doesn't have any internal structure anymore. Okay. And basically, maybe the last thing is what kind of interference you find from Russian. And the main thing about interference from Russian is that it's very limited. Because basically the period when all Enets or all Nganasans could speak both well their native language and Russian was very short. It was 1960s, 1970s. After that, kind of no children acquired the language anymore. And before that, the exposure to Russian was not enough to have any interference. And that's why, even though the language shift kind of is evident and this language has been lost almost, we see, I mean, the structures are pretty intact because the period of contact was very short. And this is a list of interference in Enets, but the picture looks pretty similar in Nganasan. Like there are some negative borrowings in the sense that there is loss of phonotactic restrictions in phonology. Like there were initial clusters, now you can borrow words from Russian and keep these initial clusters and not simplify them anymore. Or there were reduced, we see a reduced frequency of complex structures in the domain of subordination. Like all these complex non-finite forms, they're still there, but they're used less frequently and less like in a system. Like there could be several non-finite forms with complicated distribution, and now this kind of distribution is being lost. So kind of they still use these non-finite forms, but not exactly the same way that they used to be. So kind of it simplifies the whole system. And then there are some positive borrowings, like a lot of loan words from Russian, especially if you think about all the civilizational items, a lot of objects that appeared in in the life of the local people with the modern civilization. They would be all Russian. And with these loan words, you have some new phonemes coming from Russian, like f, or some new phonemes, or some, as I said, loss of non-tactic restrictions, like initial r would be impossible, now it can be there, or initial v. Yes, and then the original vowel phonemes have acquired reduction as added phonetic realization. It is not 100% from Russian, but Russian has vowel reduction, and it works in the same way that you have a stressed prominent syllable, and you have all those which are kind of pronounced with less effort. And the same in Enets, this is the first syllable that is prominent, and that very rarely would reduce its vowels, but you will see vowel reduction further on. So it may be kind of continuation of their own phonetic process, but it's definitely supported by the phonetics of Russian. And then we, of course, have close combining strategies involved in Russian conjunctions, because it was all non-finite and no words for that, what, which, when existed, except in like question words, but they were not used to connect clauses, and now they're used. But basically that's it. So you don't have colors, you don't have many other things that you can inspect, and you see like in languages of Mesoamerica when they have 200 years of Spanish or something like this. No, the period of contact was so short that the languages remained quite intact. Okay, thank you very much.